papers scattered across the desk. As the loan officer picked up the old, folded deed, glanced at it for less than 2 seconds, and dropped it into a gray bin labeled "Processed. No action required." "This one's not going to help you, Mrs. Callahan," he said, not even looking up. Margaret Callahan, 68 years old, still wearing her husband's old wedding ring on a chain around her neck, stood frozen at the counter of First Frontier Bank in Bridger County, Montana. Her husband Tom had been gone 6 weeks. In her hand, a foreclosure notice. In that gray bin, something Tom had begged her never to lose. She didn't know it yet, but that same bank would spend the next month regretting they'd ever touched that paper. Before we go further, tell me in the comments, what state are you watching from? Silence followed Margaret out of that bank, all the way to her truck, where she sat for nearly 20 minutes before she could bring herself to drive home. Home was 600 acres outside of Bridger, land Tom's grandfather had homesteaded, land the two of them had spent 31 years working together, cattle in the summer, hay in the fall, and enough hard winters that Margaret had lost count somewhere around year 15. 6 weeks earlier, Tom had been sitting up in his hospital bed, weaker than she'd ever seen him, when he grabbed her hand with more strength than she thought he had left. "The deed," he'd said, "in my desk, top drawer." "Don't you ever let that go, Maggie. Doesn't matter what anybody tells you it's worth." She'd asked him what he meant. He'd only shaken his head, already fading, already too tired to explain. 2 days later, he was gone, and Margaret had been left with a folded, water-damaged piece of paper she didn't understand, and a ranch she suddenly had no idea how to keep. First Frontier Bank had held the mortgage on the property for 11 years, ever since a bad drought forced Tom and Margaret to refinance. When Tom passed, the bank moved fast. Faster, Margaret thought, than seemed right for a woman who just buried her husband. Foreclosure notices arrived within a month. A representative named Kurt Boyle started calling weekly, always polite, always mentioning how much simpler things would be if she just accepted the buyout offer instead of fighting a mortgage she couldn't afford alone. Neighbors meant well but told her the same thing. Her own sister suggested she take whatever the bank offered and move into town, closer to family, somewhere she wouldn't have 600 acres reminding her of what she'd lost. Margaret understood why they said it. She just couldn't make herself agree. That old deed sat in her kitchen drawer for weeks before she worked up the nerve to bring it to the bank, hoping, she wasn't even sure what she was hoping, that it mattered, that Tom had been right about something, the way he usually was. Instead, hers in that hospital room. Whatever he knew about that paper, he'd known it clearly enough to spend his last strong moment making sure she understood how much it mattered. She wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. 3 weeks passed, and the bank scheduled the auction. 60 days, until Margaret's 600 acres would be sold at the county courthouse steps to the highest bidder. Kurt Boyle called to check in, reminding her the buyout offer was still on the table, still generous, still available, if she signed before the deadline. If you've made it this far, you already know this story is about to turn. And if you want to see exactly how, hit subscribe now, because what happens next changes everything for Margaret and for that bank. Margaret drove into town instead, past the courthouse, past the bank, to a small law office above the hardware store, where a young attorney named Sarah Whitfield had just opened her practice 6 months earlier. Sarah had grown up 2 counties over, daughter of a rancher who'd lost his own land in a dispute years back. And something about Margaret's story, the desperation in her voice, the mention of an old deed nobody would look at, made Sarah offer to review it for free. "I'm not promising anything," Sarah told her, spreading the fragile paper across her desk. "But I've got some time this week, and I'd like to understand what your husband was so worried about." 4 days passed before Sarah called back. Her voice had an edge Margaret hadn't heard before, not doubt, but something closer to disbelief. "Mrs. Callahan," Sarah said, "I need you to come in. I found something in the language of this deed that doesn't match what the bank filed with the county. I think we need to look at this a lot more carefully before that auction happens." Margaret's hands were shaking when she hung up the phone. For the first time since Tom passed, she let herself believe, just slightly, that he'd known exactly what he was talking about. Sarah spread 3 documents across her desk when Margaret arrived. The original deed, the bank's current mortgage filing, and a county property survey from 20 years earlier. "Look at this boundary description," Sarah said, pointing to a faded line of text on the old deed. "This lien release clause says your father-in-law's original debt on this property was fully satisfied back in 1987. But the bank's current mortgage, the one they refinanced with you and Tom 11 years ago, includes acreage this deed proves was never actually part of the collateral in the first place. Margaret stared at the papers, not fully understanding. In plain terms, Sarah said gently, First Frontier Bank added roughly 90 acres to your mortgage that they had no legal right to claim. Your father-in-law paid that portion off decades ago. This deed is the proof. And if they never had a legitimate claim to that 90 acres, it raises a serious question about whether the rest of their foreclosure paperwork holds up either. Silence settled over the small office as the weight of it landed. 90 acres the bank never owned. 11 years of mortgage payments, partly built on land that was never rightfully theirs to include. An auction scheduled in less than 5 weeks, based on a foreclosure claim that now looked deeply flawed. Can you prove this? Margaret finally asked. Sarah nodded slowly. I already pulled the county records this morning. The 1987 lien release is on file. It's real, it's recorded, and it's public. I don't think anyone at that bank ever bothered to check it before they filed against you. Or maybe, she added, quieter now, they checked and filed anyway. That possibility sat heavy between them. A mistake was one thing. A bank knowingly foreclosing on land it had no legal claim to was something else entirely, something Sarah said could mean regulatory violations, potential fraud charges, and consequences reaching well beyond Margaret's case. 2 days later, Sarah requested a meeting with First Frontier's regional manager, a man named Douglas Reyes, who'd approved the original refinance 11 years earlier. When Sarah laid the 1987 lien release on the table in front of him, Reyes's easy, practiced smile faded fast. This is an old document, he said carefully. I'd need our legal team to review it. You'll have 30 days, Sarah replied, before I file this with the State Banking Commission and the county attorney's office. I'd suggest your legal team move quickly. Reyes said nothing, but something in the tightness of his jaw told Margaret everything she needed to know. Tom had been right all along. Word moved fast once Sarah filed the complaint. Within 2 weeks, First Frontier Bank quietly withdrew the foreclosure action against Margaret's ranch, citing an internal records review. No public apology came, no admission of wrongdoing, just a letter stating the auction was canceled and Margaret's mortgage balance had been reduced to reflect the corrected acreage. That wasn't the end of it, though. The State Banking Commission opened a broader inquiry into First Frontier's foreclosure practices after Sarah's complaint flagged similar irregularities in at least 6 other cases across Bridger County. Families who, like Margaret, had been pressured into buyout offers or lost land to auctions built on paperwork nobody had double-checked. Old Man Petrov, a neighbor who'd sold 40 acres to the bank 2 years earlier under similar pressure, called Margaret once the story became public. I always figured that was just how banks worked, he told her, never thought to question it. Quiet pride settled over Margaret in the months that followed, though she rarely spoke about it unless someone asked directly. She kept ranching the same 600 acres Tom's grandfather had homesteaded, the same land she'd nearly lost to a bank that never should have claimed part of it in the first place. The old deed itself now sits framed in Margaret's front hallway, no longer folded in a kitchen drawer, no longer dismissed as worthless paperwork. Tom never explained exactly why it mattered so much. Margaret suspects now that maybe he never fully understood the details either, only that his father had trusted him to protect it, the way Margaret had trusted Tom's last request enough to fight for it herself. Sometimes the paper everyone tells you to throw away is the one thing worth holding on to. Margaret's husband knew that, even without knowing why, and it saved everything they'd built together. If stories like this move you, subscribe, because there's more coming every week.